Coming up next on the Witness the World podcast, the power of critical thinking.
And if you've ever been, you say, well, I'm so upset that I can't think straight. That's because you're so upset that you can't think straight. Your amygdala has turned off your thinking brain because it's so threatened, and it's turned on your survival brain that, yes, you literally could not think straight because the thinking part of your brain was shut off.
The content here is for informational and entertainment purposes only. Any content here should not be construed as financial, medical, or any other type of professional advice. Good day, everyone. Welcome to episode 24 of the Witness the World podcast. My name is Ben Choi, and today we're chatting with an expert in the area of critical thinking. We're pleased to have on the founder of the Critical Thinking Institute, Dr. Steve Pearlman from the United States. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me on.
So Steve, I thought you'd probably be one of the best people out there to have on to help us understand what critical thinking is all about. So from what I've gathered, you spent many years in academia teaching and studying critical thinking, and then you later on founded the Critical Thinking Institute. So to kick things off, I wonder if you can just give us a little bit about a background on about yourself and what led you to creating the Critical Thinking Institute.
Sure. So my background in academia, I was in academia for 30 years, and I was a writing instructor, first year or advanced writing instructor for students. And my interest in writing really came from my interest in critical thinking. To me, the two are interlinked, and there's actually a great deal of research on the importance of writing with respect to critical thinking, because it makes our thoughts permanent. It gives us an ability to look at them and reflect upon them, which is a very unique thing for us to be able to do. But I was surprised to learn that in academia, actually, the emphasis on critical thinking in writing, in terms of how it's directly instructed, is rare. Often writing instructors are focused on other constructs that might involve some thinking, but are not directly involved in teaching critical thinking as the explicit aim or sole aim of writing instruction. And so I really started to look at how can we teach critical thinking through writing. And there weren't great answers, actually, for most of my career. But my emphasis on it led me to a university where I founded the country's first academic department with a focus on how do we teach critical thinking, how do we understand critical thinking, how do we know what it is and its relationship to writing, and actually got results in doing that. Now, that might seem like that shouldn't be a very heavy lift, because universities all over the world claim they teach critical thinking and develop critical thinkers. But really, if we look at the research on outcomes among students in college. For example, American Association of Colleges and Universities study found just 8% of students to be proficient critical thinkers at universities. So here we have this perception that universities are teaching critical thinking, but most of the research on outcomes shows otherwise. And that's because it's not taught explicitly. And the reason it hasn't been taught explicitly is because we've just really found some of the neuroscience and some of the other cognitive psychology research that's important for understanding how do we really teach students how to think and use their brains better. And I was on the cutting edge of that. And then I realized this is something that has to come out of academia for the entire world. And that's why I founded the Critical Thinking Institute.
Good stuff. Yeah, thanks for that overview, Steve. So, I guess probably the best place to start, I think, our journey here for this episode is to, take us from the start. You have two programs I've noticed on your website. You have a program to help kids with their critical thinking, and then also another one for adults. So Let's start chronologically here and then look at kids first. So just kind of curious because I'm an uncle. I have a 4-year-old nephew. He's a very inquisitive guy, and he asks all sorts of interesting questions. And just looking at your program, I can just wondering like, oh, like should we help my little nephew kind of develop his critical thinking skills a little bit further? And then I kind of think to myself like, don't we have to let kids be kids? And if I'm a little more overbearing, get them to think of all these other scenarios. Hey, what's the pros and cons of this? And what happens if you do this? What happens to other people if you do this? Like, what kind of balance has to be struck? And, what's the right way of going about it to help, kids kind of develop their critical thinking skills, when they're young?
When they're young is the best time to start with children. There's a mythology of perception based on a very limited understanding of what happens in the brain that kids aren't equipped to learn critical thinking, and that kids can't be good critical thinkers. Every kid in the world is thinking critically all the time. They're all scientists, they're all experimenting, learning about the world, testing things constantly. That's all kids do all the time. It doesn't mean that they're learning formal critical thinking processes, but they're capable of it. The myth is that the human brain isn't fully developed or fully formed until age 25. Now, that's true in a certain respect, that different parts of the brain don't finish forming in terms of their growth until the age of 25. It doesn't mean that those parts of the brain aren't already in operation from the time that we're born. It just means that they're not fully developed. Much like, you might have your last growth spurt in your late teens or 20s. Your arm isn't fully developed. Doesn't mean you're not using your arm all the time throughout your life, just because it's not fully grown yet. You're still doing all the things that an arm does. It's just not as long or as strong as it's going to be when you're an adult. So there's this misperception that we can't teach kids to think critically. Well, the fact of the matter is, kids are thinkers from birth. They've done a study where they took kids who were newborns, still in the hospital, just out of mom, in the hospital, and they showed them an iPad. And on the iPad, there were a number of different dots. So let's say there were 12 dots, or there were 20 dots, or 8 dots. And then they played a tone, a number of tones in sequence that matched the number of dots or didn't match the number of dots. And guess what? Newborn babies could tell when the number of tones matched the number of dots and when the number of tones didn't match the number of dots. These are kids who are a few hours old in the world. Now, there had to be enough differential in the dots. So they couldn't have 12 dots and play 13 tones. The kids couldn't tell a difference. But if there was enough differential, the kids could really understand the difference already. So we teach kids and we teach adults how to think critically the same way. And the reason that we teach them the same way is because they have the same brains. You don't have a different brain when you turn 18 or 21. Again, it's developed more like your arm got longer again. But we teach the same way. What we really teach people how to do when we teach them how to think critically is we teach them what their brain naturally already does in the process of thinking, how to understand that process, how to become self-aware of that process, and how to exercise that process so to make the brain an elite instrument for critical thinking. Whatever we practice with our brains develop wiring, literally build themselves to do better. And the earlier we start with kids, and we can do it with adults too, but the earlier we start with kids, which is for us around age 8 or 9, starting to build that brain, build the wiring in that brain to think critically, the better success we have.
I see. So I guess you could say that maybe there's not too many limitations to, foster that development. Then we should expose our kids like to all sorts of different activities and, sports and, reading and that sort of thing there, and just keep getting them to move them, like they got the hamster on the wheel, keep that going there, just carry that on and just with open arms. Is that kind of fair to say?
Yes, get them off the screens for the most part. Okay, limited screen time is very important. And the damaging effects of that to the brain are becoming clearer and clearer to us. So anything more than an hour a day is shown to have really detrimental effects, especially as they're younger. right? The younger they are, the more negative the effects can be. But other than that, constant stimulation is really important for kids. And what we make a flaw in doing for kids is trying to teach them too much instead of letting them figure it out. A big mistake a lot of adults make is trying to answer kids' questions too much. So we think we're doing a good thing because we're giving them knowledge. But knowledge isn't really the most important thing. We can always get the knowledge. Can we build the brain to think better, right? So oftentimes, child might ask, as my son did, what happens to the sun at night? Why does it get dark? He was 4 or 5 at the time. I don't remember the exact age. He was very young. He's just starting to think about the world. He said, what happens to the sun? Well, that's a great question. What most parents tend to do is they say, oh, well, the sun, the earth spins and the sun goes behind, it hides behind the earth until morning. We give a simple explanation of that. What a missed opportunity. Why not instead say, what do you think happens to the sun at night? Who cares what answer they give to that question? The trick is to get them thinking about it, right? To make them come up with an answer. The answer is going to make no sense whatsoever. It doesn't matter. And then when they give an answer, you say, well, why do you think that? Or can you explain it to me further? Or how would this part work, right? Doesn't matter if they're right. Right's irrelevant at that age to that question. And it doesn't mean later you can't tell them the answer. And it doesn't mean later that there aren't some questions where we need to give them answers, of course, right? For certain things, we need to give them answers. But we should seize these opportunities with kids to enrich the brain. Let me tell you about another study. So they had a study where they were going to have kids play with a toy they'd never seen before. And they either had a person show the kids how to use the toy through a little instructional period, or they gave the kid the toy and just said, go play with it. Well, what happens, do you think, when the kids were told how to play with the toy? They didn't play with the toy that much. Why? Because someone already told them what to do with the toy. Now it's not that fun anymore. But figuring out what to do with the toy, making up their own ideas of what to do with the toy, that's interesting, right? So we just need to put kids in intellectually rich environments, keep the brain stimulated in different ways, let it grow in different ways. And that is an aid to helping them think. It's not really teaching them critical thinking, but it is wonderful for overall thinking, processing, brain development, and so forth.
I see. Yeah, thanks for those insights there, Steve. So, as part of the development of a kid's, growth is, going to the school system. And I think you touched on this off the top here, how, our school systems are not really, focusing on the critical thinking aspect. I mean, I know you're in the States, I'm in Canada, and, I remember when I was going to school, it was more so memorize this and accept this is the way we do math or whatever topic it is. We just don't ask the why part of it and figure out why we do things and why is this going to, be important? How does that relate to people and how does that help us moving forward? So yeah, just wondering, like, it sounds like the thinking has shifted a little bit. You're seeing some changes in, systems, but how far do we have to go to really shift the curriculum? And then if we do shift it, then like how big of an impact could that be on kids growing up? Like could they be more effective people in as they grow up in society, like if they had that development? And like just wondering what the possibilities are and what is the current state.
Yeah, I don't have a hopeful answer here immediately. I'm going to say this in the sense that I don't want people to go out and blame educators for this, for two reasons. The first is that educators, especially here in the US, maybe it's better in Canada, are working way too hard for too little respect and too little reward. And it's not getting any easier. And they weren't trained in how to teach critical thinking either. So they're doing the best they can and working really hard at it for the betterment of our kids. And I've trained a lot of educators, and seldom have I met one who's not deeply committed to their work and the nobility of it. The second reason is that nobody knew how to teach critical thinking really until recently. It just was a sort of a technology that didn't exist. So we can't really fault the educational system for not figuring that out entirely. Okay. That said, we're about nearly as far as we can be from successfully teaching critical thinking. We're really doing a lot of things in the educational system that are antithetical to developing critical thought. Because as you very aptly said, the emphasis is on memorization and the acquisition of knowledge instead of the development of idea. Well, knowledge used to be a very valuable commodity in the world. That's why education started, was to pass on knowledge, because a few people had it, they could disseminate it to others, and it was very rare and so forth. And it was also very limited. So even when I started in my field of composition study back in the early 90s, it was probably possible that I could read everything that was being published on composition studies if I really put my mind to it at that time. Now, there's no way I could read everything that's being published in my discipline, even if I wanted to. If I spent 24 hours a day, there are too many journals, too many publications, too many internet sites. So knowledge no longer has that commodity anymore. It's not this highly valued thing. It's so readily available, it's overly abundant. We have to make a shift from thinking that education is about the transference of knowledge, instead to the critical use of that knowledge for the construction of problem solving and new ideas. So when we make that shift, then we can change our educational system. The good news is that teaching for critical thinking is actually easier once educators learn how to do it. There's obviously a learning curve to it. But once they get through it, it's easier. Why? Because we're teaching for how the brain wants to learn, right? If we're teaching for how the brain wants to learn, it's easier way to teach than to teach the way the brain doesn't want to learn. Right now, we're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. As I've said often, and I wrote in my book, school is the only place where children learn like they do when they're in school. That's the only place children learn that way. They don't learn from lecture and those kinds of structured educational settings and constructs anywhere else in life, nor do we ever learn anywhere else in life that way. Everything else we learn differently. We learn through other kinds of repetition and experimentation and mastery and so forth. School is the only place that we are confined to trying to learn like we do when we're in school. And so really, when we make the shift to change our schools to reflect how the brain likes to learn, then it's easier on educators and more fun and interesting for the students at the same time.
If we didn't get the critical thinking, I guess, framework set up, during schooling, then it just comes down to us as adults having to, expose ourselves to different things to build the framework and that we're going to use moving forward and keep adjusting and making it better so we can, I guess, excel at whatever we want to do in life. So on that note, I thought maybe we could just go through an exercise and you can assess my critical thinking framework as I kind of go over a particular topic. And so through my years of experience doing different things, different jobs, and just being on this planet, I've come to a way of looking at things in a certain way. I'm pretty sure I have blind spots. I'm missing certain things. So I'm going to kind of share a little bit about, what goes on in the dark recesses of my mind. And we'll just kind of dip our toes in here and let you have a little assessment after. So how's that sound?
Well, that sounds okay. Let me jump in for a second
Okay.
and say two things. Okay. The first is that we have to make a distinction between intelligence and critical thinking. Everybody has a measure of intelligence, some more than others. It's what we consider naturally born, capacity for high level brain function. Okay. Some people have a little more than others, just like some people can sing, naturally born to sing better than others, or naturally born to do art better than others, or what have you. We have different aptitudes with respect to thinking as well. But that's very different than what we're talking about with critical thinking, which is a set of learned skills. The second thing is, I don't know, the way I look at critical thinking really has to do with how everybody's brain is working all the time and how do we understand that process and build on it. And so there are a bunch of different overlays that we can put on that core process. And you're going to put an overlay on it. I will try my best to see what we can see, but who knows? We might not see much, or we might see a lot as we go forward.
Okay, all right, sounds good. Yeah, thanks for that context there. So now I'm going to try to provide some context on my brain function here. So we're talking about the news media, and so this is how my brain, connects with this particular topic. I watch, I turn on the TV, I watch a news story, and what I do is I try to take the information as is. It's just the story. And then as I watch a story, the wheels start turning, the hamster is moving on that wheel, as I was kind of alluding to earlier. And then I start asking myself, why is this story, being covered, number one, and why is it covered and framed in the way it is? That's the next thing that kind of goes on my mind. And then, I watch a little more, and then I'm like, oh, there's this thought in my head. It's like, is there a vested interest for, this story being covered at all? Then the saying goes, follow the money. That kind of pops in my head. And then lastly, I step back, finish the story. It's like, oh, this story was only 30 seconds or 1 or 2 minutes. And it really lacks the context for, the audience. We're talking about maybe a really huge subject. And how can you come to any sort of conclusion or think, something is definitive after only discussing it for 2 minutes? There's so many angles. There's so much more behind it. So that's kind of my general thought process, and I'm curious to say if you can maybe assess or dissect a little bit of my process. Am I missing something? Where are my blind spots? And like good, bad, or I got a lot of work to do? Yeah, what are your thoughts?
Well, we all have a lot of work to do, right? People who say, I study critical thinking, I must be great at it. Well, there's a difference between studying critical thinking necessarily. I've met people who study critical thinking who I didn't think were very good at it. I've met people who study critical thinking who are brilliant at it. Here's what's great about what you're doing to start with. You are being reflective about what's going on in your own head and self-aware of what's going on in your own head as you are watching something. So whereas most people generally watch something and absorb it and have some kind of subconscious reaction to it, of belief or disbelief or what have you, you're having a more cognizant, conscious reaction to it. We call that metacognitive awareness. Okay. And that's an absolutely critical, essential part of teaching people to become better critical thinkers, is to become self-aware of what our own brain is doing. And you're, in a sense, therefore, monitoring your thinking as you're thinking it, which is what metacognitive awareness is. And that's absolutely great, because that's a thing that a lot of people don't do enough. They're not aware of what their brain is doing. So more power to you. Continue to do that. That's a path to better critical thinking for everybody, is to monitor our thinking while we're thinking.
It's funny. I was talking on a previous podcast about this, like how people in general, they don't think about what they're thinking about. And if they actually just did that one simple thing, they could, see the world in a whole new light. Is that kind of fair to say from what you've seen on your research?
Well, I will say that what we understand is that one of the strongest ways to help people become better critical thinkers, and one of the most integral parts of it, is what we're talking about, this metacognitive awareness. So for people to start being cognizant of what's happening in their own brain as they're doing it. We go into, that's really what our programming is about at the Critical Thinking Institute. It's teaching people all of the many things that their brain is doing as they're thinking about different things. Whatever it is, the brain's doing roughly the same series of functions. Okay. But let's look at the downside of what you did and how you articulated it as well. Okay, to be fair, right? And I think just the metacognitive awareness is actually very big, so that's great. But let's look at a little thing that you mentioned that I would take note of, right? And it's not wrong. It's not a wrong thing to do. Okay. It's just nevertheless something that we all do in certain ways that we have to be particularly aware of. So you mentioned, for example, you're always thinking, follow the money. Where's the money? Okay. Well, that's a particular lens to put on any subject matter, is this sort of economic question around it. It's not a wrong question. It's a good question to ask, but it's a limiting question, because what if follow the money isn't necessarily the best lens to use? What if economics isn't the driving force for that? Should there be a different lens that you're putting, if not instead of that lens, before that lens, before you get to that question, right? And so in that respect, you're working from the premise, your brain goes to an idea which has probably gone through many times, which is why it likes going back there, because our brains always like to go back to what they've done before. You're going back to this question of economics, right? And that's not necessarily the right lens that we want to apply to everything. It's kind of, now you have a bias, now you have a little tick in your brain that wants to do that. And so you're prone now to starting to draw conclusions that are economic about things, where economics might not be the primary lens that you want to use about it. So now what we try to do is help people become aware of those little ticks that we have, and we all have them in our minds, where we tend to go certain places because that's where we found success before. But those aren't necessarily really healthy for us, because now, in fact, we're limiting ourselves and we're leaping to certain paths of thinking when we could, in fact, go down other paths that for a given situation might be better. It's kind of one of the things we teach people at first, is to make broader assessments of a situation and talk about what might be possibly valuable to think about, instead of first deciding what is valuable to think about. Because most brains go quickly to determining what is valuable, instead of taking the time to spread it out and list the things that could potentially be valuable. Now, why do our brains do that? Our brains do that because above everything else, our brains are survival mechanisms. The brain's job, and the brain knows that this is its job in a sense, is to keep us alive, right? That's the brain's first and foremost job. And the brain can't keep us alive, then obviously it can't keep thinking, and we can't keep doing other things, especially procreate, which is also one of our brain's primary objectives for us. Whether we procreate or not, that's baked into us evolutionarily, right? So that's driving us forward. So brains that could come to quick, good decisions about what would keep us safe did a better job of procreating and creating more brains that did that than brains that couldn't come to a quick decision about what would keep us safe. Because those people didn't live to produce more people, right? So we are the descendants of people whose brains made quicker decisions about what kept us safe, about how to answer the question, about what the solution was. But that's only necessary. Those quick answers are only necessary in survival situations. In non-survival situations, where you're looking at a news broadcast about something, your life and death is not an immediate question, right? It might be a question down the road, an abstract question, but it's not an immediate question. Our brains have the time to pause a little and assess more broadly the situation rather than moving into one quick lens as to how to look at it. But we all have tendencies, myself included, to go into those quick lenses, because those lenses we feel have been successful in the past. So we want to do those again. It's not healthy for us to do that. And it doesn't mean that the lens is necessarily wrong. It just means the practice that we do that is something we have to become self-aware of as we go forward. And it's a process that when we have the time to do it, and it's not a life or death situation, it's a process that we have to start to constrain and slow down and control.
Interesting stuff there, Steve. So what I'm kind of getting from this is, so slow down, and maybe your whatever the initial instinct is when I look at, doesn't matter if it's a news story, it could be anything, just like maybe just look at it in a different, force myself to look at it in a different way. And I guess it kind of brings up kind of an example here I had. A lot of times, if you're like a manager, you think you kind of know what's the best way, what to do. But then over the years, I've kind of taken upon myself to say, hey, I want to hear the feedback from my staff, because I probably had some blind spots. They're seeing what they're doing, like right in the front there. They're dealing with the customers, and I'm probably missing something. So I got to the point where I was like, I encouraged them to, call me out on things and provide like insights and tell me how we can make things better, what's working, what's not working, what can we do better. So is maybe one aspect to improve our critical thinking is to put ourselves in that kind of uncomfortable position. Again, looking at that different angle, getting that feedback, because confirmation bias, that's comfortable. We all like to be validated, and kind of saying, oh yeah, you understand everything, you know everything. But that's not good critical thinking wise. And yeah, I just wonder if you can kind of speak to that, just being uncomfortable and looking at things, and hearing from different perspectives. That's probably a good thing for the critical thinking process.
It's great. There's a caveat, and I'll explain why it's great. But first, let me tell you the caveat. As you talked about confirmation bias, the caveat is that our brains are resistant to being wrong. And the reason that they're resistant to being wrong is exactly what I explained before. Their main job is to keep us alive. Well, so if we're alive, the brain's premise baked deep into our brain is that whatever it was thinking must have been good because we're alive. If it was what it was thinking was bad, we would be dead. So the brain must be right. And it doesn't want to admit also that it was wrong about something, because if it admits that it was wrong, then it actually had us in danger. The brain doesn't like to think that it had us in danger, right? So it doesn't like to believe that we were wrong. It likes to think that it was right, because right is safe, safe is alive, alive is good. Brain's doing its job. Okay. This is actually built into all of our brains. This is not metaphorical. This is literal parts of how our brain goes through its thinking process. Okay. But that said, the term that we like to use for what you're describing is cognitive disequilibrium. So you talked about getting uncomfortable or what have you. Piaget coined the term cognitive disequilibrium. Another way to think of that is basically confusion, to put it more simply. Okay. So when the brain's comfortable and certain and clear, and everything is right and good, and it knows what it's talking about, or at least it thinks it does, it's in cognitive equilibrium. World makes sense. Okay. Everything's fine. Cognitive disequilibrium is, whoa, suddenly something challenges the brain gets confused. And so it goes into a disequilibrium state. It doesn't know what to make of what's going on. Now, our brains hate being in cognitive disequilibrium. They hate it. Why? It's a threat. If we're confused, we don't know what keeps us safe. We don't know what keeps us safe. We're in danger. Danger can mean death, right? And so forth. So our brains hate cognitive disequilibrium. And they have to try to work as fast as possible to get back to equilibrium, to end the confusion and go back to certainty. The fact that they work fast to go back to certainty, however, means that often they make the mistake of taking the first answer that seems right, because they want to get to certainty as fast as possible. It doesn't mean they get to a right answer. It means they get to what they think is a right answer. Big difference often between what we think is a good answer and what's actually a good answer. We have to train the brain to go into those situations where it's in disequilibrium and not try to rush back to equilibrium. Instead, to enjoy the time in disequilibrium so that we learn how to think better and enjoy that process and broaden our minds instead of rushing and hiding from it and trying to get back to certainty as fast as possible. So what you're describing as uncomfort and getting into a discomfortable situation and getting different kinds of feedback that may not be what you want to hear, that's great. We call it disequilibrium, and it's what people should do more than we do, and none of us do it enough.
Yeah, that's interesting, Steve. So it's kind of like we're fighting with, I guess, human nature, our primal nature, and if we can kind of challenge our primal nature a little more, that will advance our critical thinking process, which is, yeah, that's an interesting thing there. So on that note, human beings, we're more emotional creatures, and the critical thinking process, more of how I would describe it, more of a logical IQ process. But yeah, we're fighting with that EQ, that emotional side of things there. And it's funny, if we go back to the media example, you watch something on TV, they want to rile up your emotions to get you, upset or happy or whatever the case may be. And then they might kind of say things to distract you. And from another topic, the term gaslighting, I guess that comes to mind. So with all that emotional stuff going on there, and it's like, do you have any tips on how we can kind of like center ourselves and keep us focused on our logical brain, critical thinking process, and avoid the distractions on the emotional side of things? Is there a trick to it, or do you have any tips in that regard?
We talk about this a lot in the program, in our lessons. because all of our brains think emotionally before they think intellectually. Okay? Every single one of our brains thinks emotionally first. And there's a little part of our brain called the amygdala, which is Latin for almond, and it's about the size of an almond. Therefore, you might understand the connection. And it's a little tiny part of our brain. And it's one of the most important parts when it comes to thinking critically. The amygdala is a switch, and it effectively is a switch that decides which part of our brain gets activated. It can either turn on and activate the rear part of our brain, which is the primal part, which is about survival and fast thought, okay, and instinctive thinking, or it can switch on the front part of our brain, which is the part that's for advanced critical thinking, intellectual ideas, careful thoughtfulness, and so forth. Problem is, if the amygdala gets scared, if it feels that the body's under threat in any way, if we're under any danger, it switches on the back part of our brain, which turns on our fight or flight recess, so that we have access to, making a quick decision and surviving. Okay? Not great for intellectual thought, though. But the amygdala hasn't evolved enough, and it doesn't understand that non-physical threats aren't really threats to us. So it takes things that are stressful or challenging or different, and it also interprets them as threats to our survival. Whereas what it's really designed for is physical threats to our survival, actual immediate threats to our well-being, physical well-being. It just doesn't know the difference. It hasn't evolved enough to know. And this is why students might freak out when they have a test and they get all stressed out about a test. And then they get into the test and they forget about what they studied, because the amygdala literally shut off the thinking part of their brain and turned on the survival part of the brain because it felt so threatened by the stress of the test. The test is no real threat to the survival of the body, but the amygdala doesn't get that. It doesn't understand the distinctions, unfortunately.
Huh, yeah. I've had that threat in my mind many a times actually when I was going to school. So yeah, the test results did not end up very well, but now I know how my brain works, so I can do way better. So that's part of the evolution. So
right, all students have, and all people have. And if you've ever been, you say, "Well, I'm so upset that I can't think straight," right? That's because you're so upset that you can't think straight. Your amygdala has turned off your thinking brain because it's so threatened, and it's turned on your survival brain that, yes, you literally could not think straight because the thinking part of your brain was shut off. How do we change that? We give a lot of different techniques for approaching that, but here's one way that you can think about it. It's very interesting studies have been done on this that have found that if we take a situation that where it's found as being a threat to us, stress that's a threat, and we try to reframe that stress as a challenge, that it actually calms down the amygdala and lets us think better. It's the same stress one way, it's the same input one way or another that's coming into us, the same stimulus that we're facing. And it can be stressful in both regards, right? So the test can be stressful one way or the other. The argument that we're in can be stressful one way or the other. The job interview can be stressful one way or the other. If we can take it and say, okay, this is a threat, how can we think of it as a challenge? What works in terms of thinking of it as a challenge is to start enumerating for ourselves those mechanisms and those resources that we have within ourselves or available to us that help us overcome the stressor. And if we start to, and it's best actually done if it's out loud or in writing, but we can do it in our heads as well. If we start to actually make an enumeration of what are my resources for why I can overcome this stressor, right? I can best the situation, then that actually is shown to start to calm the amygdala down, and it turns on the thinking part of the brain again.
Interesting stuff there, Steve. So I guess another way to help, someone improve their critical thinking is to take up a program like what you guys offer, whether it's for kids or for adults. I'm just kind of curious to see, just to help our audience kind of understand like how much of a benefit it is to, put the time in to work on your critical thinking skills. Like if you can maybe just share maybe a story or two with, some of the people that have been through some of your programs to see like what some of like the before and after results are like for kids, like maybe you helped out some kid that was getting like a C grade average, and then they all of a sudden they work through your program after I don't know a few months, and then they became like a straight A student. I don't know if there's anything like that. And then for adults, like maybe they were just kind of like floundering in life, didn't have direction, and just got always frustrated with certain things. And then maybe they kind of changed their brain a little bit, and then they looked at things differently and become very successful at whatever they were doing. So I don't know if there's some couple of stories, some interesting stories, maybe you could share for some people that have been through your program.
Well, we have all kinds of stories from people who use the program. I think one of the most compelling ones to me, because it showed the chain reaction that this can have, is one of our users who had a friend of theirs come to them in deep distress about something and didn't know what to do and didn't know how to make a decision and was, just in terrible shape about something. And this user of the program, who hadn't been through the full program yet, was able to recognize that this person was in what we call an amygdala hijack and was contending with all kinds of challenges and so forth, and was able to walk that other person through some of the lessons and practices and methods that we use to move that other person, help somebody else in life move to a place where they could think through their decision better and eventually calm down and feel as though they had control over their lives again with respect to what was something that was very serious and very important to them. And I think that, for me, was one of the most powerful examples of what we're doing at the Critical Thinking Institute. Because it's one thing for us to help individuals, as they move themselves through life in terms of more career success, or kids getting a better grade, or kids being able to interact better with their parents, or what have you, right? And we're so proud of that. That's wonderful. But to see the ripple effect, to see the chain reaction, to see somebody who not only understood what we were doing well enough to help themselves, but well enough to walk somebody else through a better thinking process that made their life better. That's very meaningful to me, because the more people that we can affect with this, the more thinking we have in the world, and the more thinking we have in the world, then inevitably the better a world we're going to have.
That's well said, Steve. So, I was just thinking maybe we can leave our audience off with maybe one or two, things that they could do, starting today, something easy that they can do today that maybe they don't have the means to join your program, don't have time, whatever the case may be, but something that they can do, just at home, wherever they are in the world. Are there like two like go-to things that you would tell someone that's, wanting to begin this journey down this path to better critical thinking?
Well, first of all, everyone has time. Our lessons are only about 10 minutes long each. So everyone has time to do this. It's not a big time burden. It's intentionally short because the idea isn't to bog people down in a lot of knowledge. The idea is to spark people's thinking with a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of idea of what to go out and practice next. That's, I think, the biggest tip that we always like to give everybody is really something that you brought us upon already in this podcast, which is to start becoming metacognitively aware of your own thinking process. And that can be done, we recommend, easily through a journal. Okay, just a simple journaling exercise every night, a couple times a week. Okay, where you sit down and you think about something that you're thinking about, a decision you have to make going forward, a decision you had made in the past. It just doesn't matter whatsoever. And you think about what are the things that you're thinking about, what are the things that your brain is doing in making that decision. What are you valuing? Why are you valuing it? What's troubling you? What can't you figure out? Why can't you figure out? What are the unknowns? What are things you wish you knew, right? How does this relate to a previous problem? How is your brain approaching this problem like it did a previous problem, and so forth? And just keeping a journal that's trying to become more cognizant of your own thoughts and your own thinking process. That, until you start to become aware of what your brain's doing, there's no way you're going to control it to do it better. The first step that we all have to take to controlling our brains is realizing that it's going to do certain things. We're all going to have certain thinking habits. What are they? What's your brain doing? How are you thinking? So just writing a journal a couple times a week makes you self-aware of what your brain's doing. Then you'll start to realize, wait a second, I'm realize that my brain's doing it. I'm about to make a decision. I realize my brain just did that thing that I talked about in my journal a few times. I'm not going to let it do that thing again. I'm going to stop it and make it do something else. But you wouldn't have gotten there if you didn't start to do it. And then that can become a cyclical process, a positive cycle of getting better and better at recognizing more and more things that your brain's doing and starting to whittle down on the bad ones and starting to build up on the good ones. The other thing I would recommend is that to realize that our brains use something called heuristics. A heuristic is what's essentially a framework or a model for solving a problem. Whenever you go to solve any problem, what your brain does, and this is really deep into neuroscience, actually, this isn't a metaphor, this is you actually having on the level of the neurons in your brain. Your brain decides which problem is this one most like that I've solved before. And it uses that same model that you've used before and applies it to this new problem. Now, that's good in a way because many problems have some relationship to prior problems, and your brain already figured out one way to approach this type of problem in your life. And rather than in reinventing how to do it from scratch, it goes back to the old model and uses it. The problem is that the new problem might not really be exactly the same as the old problem. There are probably some important distinctions between the new problem and the old problem. So the old heuristic that you have, though it might be the closest thing that you can come to use, still probably doesn't really fit the new problem. If you become aware of that and realize, wait a second, what is my brain falling back on to use to face this new question or challenge or life problem that I'm facing? And what are the differences between my old model, my old framework, my old heuristic, and this new situation? Where are they different? Then you can start to say, hey, wait a second, you know what? This old model I've got, it's useful. It's got some elements here, but I got to tweak it first if I'm going to better apply it to this new problem. So those are two things that we ask people to start doing that are extremely useful to becoming better critical thinkers.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks for sharing, Steve. So, yeah, we covered a lot of great stuff here today. So, what I normally like to do with my guests at the end of each podcast is ask them a two-parter question to close. So, here goes.
Fire away.
What are you most grateful for, and what are you most looking forward to in the future?
What am I most grateful for? I always, it's always challenging to find questions that are most grateful for, because I'm grateful for so many things. And I think at different points in my life, I'm grateful for different things. But I think that this one kind of does also have a certain answer that lends itself to me pretty quickly, which is my son. I'm certainly most grateful for my son, who's 13 years old. And not only because of the amazing person he is, I always say he's who I want to be when I grow up, but because of how he's forced me to become a better person, a better father, and to look at the world and look at myself through his lens in order to bring someone else to fruition in the world where they're capable of taking on the world on their own and so forth. So definitely my son, I'm most very grateful for. Now, the second question was,
what are you most looking forward to in the future?
I'm most looking forward to in the future. Well, it's such a hard time, right? I think I'm looking forward to seeing a moment where we get to see another kind of enlightenment. I don't know if I'm going to see it or not. It's hopeful, right? But there's, we talk about the European Enlightenment and so forth, and there are many periods in history in different cultures that were similar, but where there was a greater realization of who we are and what our purpose is and how to use reason to advance the world forward and in terms of human rights and so forth. And I think we're on the cusp, we might be on the cusp of that again, partly because we're facing so many different challenges right now as a world, but partly with the emergence of AI and ChatGPT, which I don't think is going to help enlighten us, but is going to force us to reflect on what's important in humanity and what is unique about the human mind that is not replicable by artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence is really still a misnomer. There's really no artificial intelligence yet. But I think, nevertheless, that there's a hope of mine that I'm going to see us make this transformation to realize about, again, what's uniquely special about the human mind and how can we treasure that and amplify that. That's my hope.
Well said, Steve. Those are some interesting thoughts that you're gonna leave me off with, and probably our audience. How does that relate to the future and all of us? So, yeah, thanks for sharing, Steve. And so, if people wanted to connect with you and learn more about you, where can they find you?
Yeah, just come on down to the Critical Thinking Institute. We're at thectinstitute.com. That's thectinstitute.com, and you can learn all about what we offer when you get there.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, we'll be sure to add those details to our show notes. So that's a wrap for episode 24. If you like this podcast, please give it a thumbs up or hit the subscribe button below. If you didn't like this podcast, give it a thumbs down, but please do tell us why with a comment below. If you have any other comments, feedback, or suggestions, you know what to do. Thanks for joining us, and namaste, everyone.